Now, there are a lot of weird theories on what supports optimal health, but there are certain things we can all agree on. Red meat's gonna raise your cholesterol, smothering things in butter's gonna destroy your arteries, and a ribeye a day keeps the doctor an arm's length away. Those are facts. Or are they? Contrary to popular belief, what if I told you that steak was a superfood? Well, I hope your mouth is watering because thousands of people are finding newfound success and reversal of diseases like type 2 diabetes eating only meat. Okay, but there's gotta be some caveats, right? Well, today we're gonna be talking to Scott Myslinski, host of the show Carnivore Cast, a podcast about the carnivore diet and lifestyle where he interviews experts, researchers, doctors, and everyday people who are overcoming seemingly the impossible. He is also the host of the new Making a Man podcast, which covers topics such as masculinity and manhood with a variety of experts covering relationships, body image, stoicism, and much more. So today we're gonna try to answer the following questions. Why is the carnivore keto lifestyle seemingly so life-changing? Where are the pitfalls? And how can we really make a man out of you? Mulan style. And hey, if you're enjoying the podcast, make sure to hit the subscribe button and notification bell so that you don't miss any of the amazing guests that we have coming up on the show. And with that, let's just jump right into it. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. I'm really excited to get into the meat and potatoes, maybe without the potatoes with you, about the carnivore lifestyle and what you do over at Carnivore Cast, and also your new podcast, Making a Man, which reminds me of the Mulan movie, which I have a fond deep part in my heart for. The cartoon version, live action, not so much.
Yeah, agreed.
But I just kind of wanted to open up just for anyone that isn't familiar with what you do. If you're watching this, you probably are a little familiar with Scott over here at Carnivore Cast and what he's been doing over there. But I just kind of wanted to ask, what made you originally a meathead? And what was sort of the genesis for you of creating the Carnivore Cast and interviewing all these experts and various people?
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks for having me, Ryan. Really appreciate it. Great to chat with you and appreciate the kind words. So I found the carnivore diet back in 2016 before it was cool. No, before it was super mainstream, and stumbled upon it. You know, a slow evolution from a standard American diet to intermittent fasting and kind of Mark's Daily Apple type primal diet, and eventually keto. And just heard on a couple podcasts some very smart people like Amber O'Hearn and Ash Simmons talking about potential dangers of plant foods, and more importantly, that maybe plant foods aren't required for optimal health. And I thought that was really interesting. And I was already doing keto and wasn't really tracking like my macronutrients, my fat versus protein. So I was doing a pretty meat heavy version of keto. I was like, why don't I just drop the nuts and avocado and spinach and mushrooms for a little bit and eat as much meat as I want? That sounds great. And I did a pretty poor version of it. There are a lot better resources out now about how to do a carnivore diet successfully. Those didn't exist back then, or at least the ones that did exist, I didn't find. And so I made a lot of mistakes, but it still worked really well for me. It improved my body composition, my digestion, my energy, my mental clarity. And I really enjoyed it, and started learning more and more about it, and decided I wanted to share and give back to the community in some ways and highlight other people's stories and learn from experts. And so it's a great opportunity to start a podcast back in 2018. And since then, I've done an episode every week with either an expert or a doctor or researcher, or what I like to call N=1 case studies of folks who have overcome things like diabetes and PCOS and major depression and Crohn's with carnivore or ketogenic type diets. So that's been kind of my meathead story.
So my introduction to the carnivore diet was 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with idiopathic small fiber neuropathy, which is pretty much just like general peripheral neuropathy, only it's much harder to diagnose because there's there's not a great test for it, because when you do like an EMG or other sort of nerve conduction study, it doesn't show up because it's in the small fibrous nerves that are your sensory nerves. So that it's not motor related. And
Right.
so you have to get like a skin punch biopsy, and it's this whole kerfluffle of months and months of like, believe me, doc, it's going on. Trust me. I wouldn't make this up for fun. I don't like seeing you that much. I think a lot of people, and you've noticed this with, I'm sure, a lot of N-of-1 cases you've dealt with, or various experts that work in the field, that are doctors, et cetera, that when you're in the system, you don't really realize how bad it is until you need the system, until you rely on it. And so it's really, I've had a lot of other medical professionals on, such as Michelle Hearn, who's a nutritionist, registered dietitian, who saw very similar things as a dietitian, working with patients that have type 2 diabetes, and just seeing the disparity that happens in those populations with the standard of care. And you realize that the standard of care is just a mess. That's why I appreciate what you're doing, giving back to the community and just getting that information out there, and all the other resources that you have now on your website, carnivorecast.com, right? Is that correct?
Yep. That's it.
You have a lot of good resources there. So if anyone's interested in learning more about this, you have great beginner stuff there, which, like you said, wasn't available in 2016. I'd never heard of it. I think I maybe just heard about keto, and I thought it was the craziest thing I ever heard of. I was like, what? You need like 400 grams of carbs a day to even like work out normal. So I would assume, you're kind of the black sheep in your family for this sort of way of eating. But I kind of wanted to talk about some of the improvements you've seen on the diet. I know you mentioned digestion as something, and that's something that a lot of people see. I've seen that. I didn't know I had bad digestion until I started doing more animal-based. So kind of, what have you seen, and what have you seen majorly with the people that you've interviewed that kind of amazed you?
I mean, great question. So all over the board, in terms of other people, I'll start with my own because it's simpler. So for me, the things I noticed right away were greater satiety. Not being hungry between meals is great. Being able to just feast and have a big meal of meat and animal-based foods, and then not feeling weird cravings or mood swings or huge dips in energy throughout the day. Just being very steady, and that's not always immediate for people. So I want to be transparent that, like, when people start the diet, it very well could still have a lot of cravings, and a lot of those things takes time to adapt. But for me, that was fairly immediate. And then, my digestion just improved a lot. It just became a lot simpler and more streamlined. You don't have as much like bulk and fluff in your diet. So, you go to the bathroom a lot less, and it's very clean and easy. Some people have some digestive issues with transitioning. I'd argue that happens whenever you change your diet majorly. From vegan to carnivore, or carnivore to vegan, you're going to have some digestive issues. Just your body adapting to processing a lot of fat and protein, whereas it may not be used to that. And then, for me, like, workout performance increased a lot. I felt stronger. I put on more muscle. I lost some fat. And I became way less reliant on caffeine, which was awesome. I became like really sensitive to it. Like what used to just kind of like get me up would be like send me buzzing. And so I pretty quickly tapered back my caffeine use, and then eventually dropped it altogether. Actually, I've been able to systematically reintroduce a lot of carbohydrate foods and a lot of plant foods since I did the carnivore diet very, very strictly for 3 years. And that worked very well for me. And then I did a very slow and systematic food reintroduction protocol. And so I've been able to tolerate a lot more, and a lot more than I was able to pre-carnivore, which has been great. But in terms of other people, it's all over the board, which is what really probably amazes me the most, is the diversity of things that people have found relief from, or found benefits of the carnivore diet. And that's not to say it's a magic pill by any means, but I think just as an elimination protocol, it's very effective, because a lot of people can have reactions or issues with certain foods and not know it necessarily. But the number one thing that's been the most surprising to me is the mental improvements that some people have spoken about. Folks who have suffered from major depression or anxiety or all these things for years and years and tried several different medications and other types of therapies, CBD, plant therapies, etc., and found no relief until they've come to a carnivore diet. That is the most mind-blowing to me.
I think that's probably the biggest thing I've talked about when I've had other people on the podcast, especially in our podcast we recently did with Michelle Hearn, because my mom, for instance, is a first grade teacher, and she's noticed over her 30 years of teaching that kids are coming in and being diagnosed with things like anxiety, a lot of different sort of psychological disorders that she just didn't see when she started teaching in the 90s. And I think it's a real progressive problem that it's not just simply it wasn't just simply being underdiagnosed. I think we have kids just developing these things more often because of the way we treat our bodies younger and younger, especially at those vital moments of growth. And I was somebody that was super anxious. I suffered from an eating disorder for several years. And one of the things I noticed when I started just kind of lessening general just shifting my diet around, not to say all carbohydrates are bad. As you've noticed, you've reintroduced stuff, etc. But as I've shifted my diet around, just to kind of create an elimination, and I think that's where carnivore diet can serve a really great purpose. I think the one mistake people make is doing it and then not doing it long enough to really see a change. And that was my problem too, where I would jump from diet to diet and not really giving one enough time to really see anything. I think people say like 3 to 6 months, generally speaking, to try something to really get your body working optimally, because some people are sicker than other people. I'm probably sicker than maybe you were, or some other people I know, just because I know my health history with eating disorder and stuff like that. And people that have eating disorders have terrible problems and may not even know it. So hormones, all of that stuff. So I think giving it time, if you're going to do something like this, is really valuable. But the mental health aspect I found really fascinating, because it just sort of resets all your neurotransmitters, from what I understand. And all of those things are synthesized in your gut. And gut health is getting more attention now, but it's still an emerging science. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see if Sean Baker gets this carnivore diet study done. I would really love to see what that does. I know you mentioned you had more sustained energy, better workouts, but I was curious if you've seen any difference, whether or not you've tested it yourself or just people you've spoken to, with hormones, whether that's like thyroid, because I know some people say like thyroid dips. Some people have had improved thyroid if it's autoimmune. And then also things like testosterone. I was curious about conversations you've had about those things.
Really great points. And I agree with everything you said about gut health and the gut-brain connection. I think that's super interesting. And I definitely need to listen to more of your episodes on that. But so hormones, really interesting. I'm certainly not an expert there, but I have talked to people who have improved their hormonal profiles with carnivore. From what I understand, and also I'll say I am on testosterone replacement therapy. So it's a little bit different for me in that, like, it doesn't really matter what I eat or what I do. My levels are kind of going to be good because I'm getting it all artificially anyways. My body doesn't need to produce it. But I think both in terms of testosterone and like sex hormones, as well as thyroid hormone, I suspect less of it has to do with what type of diet you're eating, and more of it has to do with making sure you are in a caloric surplus more of the time, making sure you're eating enough, basically. Because a lot of people come to me, or I see people in the carnivore keto communities who have really low testosterone, low thyroid hormone, like dysregulated thyroid, and they've just been dieting for way too long, and they've been restricting themselves, and they're combining dieting with one meal a day, with multiple day fasts, with CrossFit 6 times a week, with a really stressful job and not sleeping enough, and like all these things. That's going to ruin your hormones more so than what whether you're eating plants or not, I think, at least. But again, I'm not an expert in hormonal health.
No, I just was curious if you had any interesting conversations. I would almost label you as like a hobbyist citizen scientist. That's why I consider myself. I like data,
Thanks.
but I definitely have like my degree's in digital media. I know how to put up a camera and shoot it. That's like my expertise. But I'm by no means an expert in any of these fields. But sometimes, like you said, an N of one is kind of sometimes really valuable data that I think is not talked about enough.
Yeah, the closest I've seen is Carnivore Kurt. He did a few repeat lab tests on his testosterone and hormonal profile and talked about how he improved his testosterone. And I think it was the very same thing for him. He was doing OMAD, 1 meal a day, and also probably under eating and probably eating. Sometimes you have to play with the macronutrient ratios. If you're eating too much protein and not enough fat, that can affect your hormonal health. We need fat, we need cholesterol. It's a precursor to testosterone and some of these hormones. So that was, he was able to, I think he has some like clickbaity YouTube videos where it's like, I tripled my testosterone. But yeah, I think that was a big factor for him, was going from 1 meal a day to more frequent meals and also increasing. One thing I have seen across the board is a lot of men on ketogenic or carnivore diets have really high sex hormone binding globulin. And what that does is basically when you have testosterone in your body produces testosterone, and then that testosterone can go in multiple directions. It can either become free testosterone, which is like important for a lot of functions like building muscle, feeling healthy, basically like being a man, a lot of the main functions. It can go into dihydrotestosterone, DHT, which is responsible for you losing your hair, growing body hair. It's also important for sexual function. Or it can go into estrogen through aromatization. What sex hormone binding globulin is it's kind of like the dam that stops the total testosterone from going through those processes. So it's kind of like a storage warehouse. And when you have it really, really high, it can stop your testosterone from converting into those downstream important forms of testosterone that are more bioavailable and your body needs. So I don't know exactly why that happens, but it seems to be a very common pattern that men, when they use really low carb diets, often will have a really high sex hormone binding globulin, which can be a problem.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. It's just really interesting about the testosterone. I've been kind of going down that rabbit hole recently myself, because I was somebody that met with a functional neuro back in January, had everything tested, never tested my testosterone. I don't know why I never thought about it, just because of my health history. My eating disorders tank everything. I was pretty much figured out I had hypothyroid, which would have been nice to know. But also my testosterone, my total, and the ranges have consistently been going down as a population because we're more and more unhealthy. So they keep changing the ranges of what's actually healthy and normal. It's insane. But mine was like super tanked. I think my total testosterone was like 118 or something like that.
That's what mine was consistently before I started therapy. I had it tested, multiple doctors, multiple sources, multiple times a day, multiple labs for over a year, and it was consistently like 100 to 150.
It was really fascinating because I was put on a replacement, which at the time was a cream, which I don't really like the creams. I'm not sure what you're doing, if it's shot or patch.
No, I do injections. I'm not a fan of creams because it's like so imprecise. You don't know exactly how much you're getting. You have to be really careful. Like you can't transmit it to anyone else. You have to be careful with your sheets. Like if it gets onto like my wife, that would be a disaster. I'm not a huge fan of the creams.
Yeah, I can't remember why he was like such a fan of the cream, other than maybe convenience, like you just have it all the time. It was
a lot
really
of people are
confusing
phobic of needles and don't want to do injections themselves too. So I think that's a big reason.
That makes sense. But it was interesting because I went on replacement for a while. And like you said, it's not very reliable because it's like, how much is a dose? And like the dose is getting all over your hand. It's like, is it getting absorbed? There's so many factors. And so my testosterone, when I did it again, and I'm only talking about total, the other factors are also important. It's not like a silo. But mine like went up 100 points in like so many weeks for a retest. So it didn't do anything.
Yeah,
And
that's
then I
not a lot.
went, and then I went off for 2 weeks to
Yeah.
test what is it like. Is it like your pituitary glands not working, etc.?
Yeah.
And funnily enough, my testosterone went from 218 to like 440
Oh, wow.
without anything.
That's
So
interesting.
then they put me on an injection like yourself.
Yeah.
And I just retested recently a week ago, and it dropped to 293.
Weird.
And it's so fascinating.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to do one more experiment before I go back on just a higher dose of injection.
Yeah.
But I was going to go off for a similar number of weeks and see if it goes up naturally by itself again.
Yeah.
Or not. But there's so many
Yeah.
nuances to this whole discussion.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors. Time of day makes a huge difference. Like how you slept the night before, those can all really affect your readings.
Hey, I hope you've been enjoying today's podcast. I don't know if you noticed, but we've been talking a lot about food. But frankly, much of today's food quality just isn't what it used to be. From nutrient-depleted soils to added hormones, antibiotics, it's bad. You see, when it comes to food quality, that's why I always trust sources like regenerative farms such as Billy Doe Meats. Their products come directly from pasture-raised farms with top-notch standards of care and husbandry. You see, and that's why I love them so much. In fact, I have a recurring subscription with them so that I can get a variety of meats whenever I want. And if you use code R2R, you can save 10% on any of your purchases whenever you want. And by working together with farms like Billy Doe Meats, maybe we can make an ecosystem that works for us all.
So like you mentioned, you've been reintroducing stuff after 3 years of doing pretty straight carnivore.
Yeah.
What were some downfalls or pitfalls in the diet that you found, whether that was health related or just, I wouldn't even want to say convenience related, because convenience, it's actually more convenient for me.
Yeah.
But I was just curious if you did see any downfalls to doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I found the diet super convenient and satisfying overall. I would say the downside for me was I got to a point where I couldn't eat enough, and digestion actually went back in the other direction. So for me, at the time, I was 160 pounds, and I needed to eat close to 4,000 calories just to maintain my body weight. And I found consistently that I couldn't eat I could eat more than 150 grams of fat a day. I was tracking pretty closely.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to talk about macronutrients, but I couldn't eat more than 150 grams of fat a day for more than 2 weeks at a time without starting to have problems. I could do it for a day or two, and I would feel better with the higher fat. But if I did it for more than 2 weeks, like clockwork, I would start getting this thing where in the middle of the night, really far away from my meals, but at like 2 or 3 a.m., I would get extremely bloated and just keep burping over and over again, like really uncomfortably, and have to like spend hours in the bathroom just trying to get all this gas out of my system. It was really uncomfortable. And so I would have to keep my fat below 150. And so if your fat is below 150, you're getting at most 1,000 calories from fat a day. And then if you do the math, if I need 3,000 or 4,000 calories to sustain my body weight and I'm not eating any carbs, that's a lot of protein. And when you eat that much protein, you run into some issues with sweating a lot, having to go to the bath, having to urinate a lot. And like protein just isn't a good fuel source. Protein is a building block. Protein is really important for not just muscles, but organs, skin and nails, all your teeth, all these things, your bones, but it's not efficient to get a lot of your energy from protein. So I kind of hit this wall about 3 years into the diet where I said to myself, okay, I'm eating like 400 grams of protein a day or more, sometimes 600, and I'm just not feeling great. And I've tried all these things to up my fat, and I tried different sources. I tried suet. I tried, spacing my meals. I tried everything, digestive enzymes. I worked with nutritionists, and just felt like I was hitting a wall. So at that point, I started slowly introducing carbs, again, starting with one very individual source at a time, testing it, tracking my data, how did it make me feel? How did it affect my digestion? How was my energy? How was my satiety? And then after 3 days of introducing a certain food, I would go back to baseline, reset, and let it clear out, and then I would try another food. And it was a slow and tedious process, but I was able to eventually reintroduce a lot of foods that way.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. It's funny because I literally just went through this myself where the other night I did a really bad experiment. I was like, I haven't really had things in a while. So I decided to have like a bunch of fiber, which was so stupid. I don't know why I thought this was a thing. Had a bunch of fiber, and then we went out, we got sushi. I had like soy sauce on my food as well, which I haven't had in ages. So that wasn't happening. And then at night I was like, you know what sounds really good at about 7 p.m. at night? 1 pound of lamb ribs. So I had that, and then in the middle of the night, I just woke up with this like huge cramping in my stomach.
I'm sorry.
I'm still kind of getting over it, but that I think that fat threshold is a really real conundrum for people, especially if you're doing like rendered fat, or even if you're not fully carnivore and you're more animal based. So you do things like olive oil or avocado oil. Those oils screw you if you try to do a lot of oils. And even just like you mentioned, you trying suet and stuff like that, and digestive enzymes and all these things, there's only so far you can go before things kind of start messing up. And like you said, you can only push protein so much because your body it converts it. And I kind of don't like how many people talk about gluconeogenesis and seem to like lean on it a lot of times for energy, because it's not a clean bioprocess in our bodies. It's not clean at all. It's like burning diesel.
Yeah, it's expensive.
So yeah, there's only so far you can go, especially when you're someone that doesn't need to lose weight. It's much easier to lose weight than gain weight on a carnivore way of eating.
I agree.
But I was curious what your thoughts were on the plant toxicity spectrum.
Yeah. Great points. I agree with what you said, and sorry to hear about your experience the other night.
We all go through things.
Yeah, I had many of those experiences. The food reintroduction was a slow and roller coaster of a process, so it wasn't all smooth sailing. But I will say this about food toxicity: very much so, when you reintroduce a food, you may have negative reactions to it at first, and that doesn't mean that food is harmful to you in perpetuity. So for instance, I made similar mistakes to you where when I was doing my food reintroduction, I got a little bit overzealous and at times went from like 20 grams of fiber a day to 40 grams of fiber a day. And I was like, this will be all right. And it wasn't. And I had to keep resetting back to carnivore along the way. And a lot of the foods that, I would try once, I'd be like, oh, this makes me feel bloated. This gives me stomach aches. This is awful. Today I can eat because I was just carnivore for so long, and my gut, my microbiome wasn't used to processing any of these foods. So sometimes when you reintroduce a food, you may think it's quote unquote toxic or doesn't agree with you, but it might just need like a couple chances. So that's the first thing I'll say. But yeah, I think definitely food toxicity and the spectrum is a real thing. And I highly encourage people to look at sources much smarter than myself on this. But like Paleo Medicina, the clinic out of Hungary, they may have changed their name, is a great source for this. Health Coach Kate is awesome on Instagram and Twitter. And Judy from Nutrition with Judy, she's really an absolute expert in the space, and she helped me a lot. But Paul Saladino as well. And I think kind of the consensus there is like things like low sugar fruits, berries, honey, and like squash. Those things are usually pretty mild for most people. And then, just moving up the spectrum to things like mushrooms, other forms of fruit. Rice is like rice basically has nothing in it except just carbs. It's not high in fiber. It's not high in a lot of oxalates or cisylates or anything like that. So that's pretty mild. And then when you get more and more complex and foods with more ingredients and more processing, like bread and certain types of dairy cause a lot of inflammation for some people. That's where it can get more and more complicated. But yeah, I think absolutely if people are considering adding in new foods, definitely starting with the things that are least toxic and least disruptive to the gut. And then, another thing, like, I think a great thing to think about as a carnivore, as someone who follows some of these diets, is you may not agree with a lot of other diets, but there are things to draw from, like the low FODMAP diet. When I was reintroducing foods, I would consult that list of FODMAPs all the time, because those are the foods that most people have the most problems with. Things like a lot of cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and onions and garlic. Like, these things are just look at the data, they seem to upset the most amount of people. So I think drawing from those types of resources as well can be really helpful.
Yeah, I was a big broccoli onion guy for a long time, and people wondered why I was so gassy all the time. And I kind of wondered too, but I didn't feel bad enough to care about it. But I could clear a room. I had a funny story where my business partner, we were sitting and working on some video stuff, and I just let one out, and he had to go get a fan, and just like this huge, like big fan. It was hilarious. I mean, it wasn't good. But you brought up a lot of good points, and like those resources you mentioned too, like Health Coach Kate and Nutrition with Judy, who we've actually interviewed before. She's really good and has a lot of good like infographics for people to look at that I think kind of dumbs it down for some of us like more picture oriented people. But I know you mentioned it actually briefly before we started talking about this, about your reintroduction, but just for people that are listening, could you give just like kind of like a basic rundown of maybe if you're wanting to try and reintroduce something, like kind of just what you did, kind of breaking it down so that maybe they can go about it? Because I think people make the mistake of, like you said, we've done it too, being too overzealous and jumping in even with one food and then messing it all up and then being like, oh no, we got to go all the way back.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. And I think I borrowed this primarily from the Whole30 food program. That's very popular, kind of paleo-esque diet, where people cut out a lot of foods for 30 days and then they reintroduce them in a systematic way. So I copied that. I know Nutrition with Judy, in her book Carnivore Cure, has an amazing food reintroduction protocol, I believe. So those are great resources to draw from. But very basically, what I did is I started, so what I did is I started with one food at a time, not a food group, but one food. So not all fruit, but like bananas. And I would have one serving at one meal a day for 3 days. And I usually tried to make it at breakfast or lunch, so it was least likely to interfere with my sleep. So I would have one banana at lunch. I would have my full carnivore meal, all foods. And then, after I'd already eaten those foods, so it wasn't, the first thing to go into my stomach, I would have a banana at lunch. And then I would do that for 3 days. And like I said, I would document, how did it make me feel? How did it affect my digestion? How did it affect my satiety? And how did it affect my energy? And then after 3 days, I would cut it out. 24 hours, back to carnivore diet. And here, I would go back and say, is this food working for me? Did this help? Did it score highly on those criteria? And if it did, here you have an option. You can either keep that food in permanently, or you can cut it out and just go back to carnivore and test the next food. Depends on your preferences, or how well that food did for you, or how much you need to reintroduce foods to your diet. And then I would move on to the next food. And so I could do basically 2 foods a week or close to that. And it was a slow and monotonous process, again, because I wasn't doing food groups. I was doing one food at a time, and it was like honey, bananas, then I think other fruits, then maybe rice, then Greek yogurt, and I just kind of moved slowly on that spectrum. And squash and low sugar vegetables. I was like, I had mushrooms for 3 days, and I would see how I did. But again, there's a spectrum here of like speed and certainty versus speed versus certainty, basically. So you could, if you wanted to be really careful, you could test a food for 2 weeks and then return to baseline for a week. But how long would it take you to reintroduce 20 foods? That would take over a year. So there's a trade-off there. And I aligned on the 3 days on, 1 day off approach, but some people do 5 days on, 2 days off. It's different for everyone. So yeah, I encourage people to do your own research, but that protocol worked pretty well for me and my wife as well. She actually used it too. And the foods that worked well for me didn't necessarily work for her, but she learned very quickly through that process.
Yeah, I think bioindividuality is a real thing. So, and people's guts are always in different places. That's what makes it kind of so interesting, is it's not always a one size fits all. That's why it is important to kind of do these experiments. I don't think I could do it. I would have to do it like you. I don't think I could do it for 2 weeks, and then it would take years for me to get anywhere. One thing I do find curious is like there's this big debate with the whole like fructose thing of like whether or not fructose is like a optimal thing to have, or if it's basically cancer. I was wondering just where your brain is wrapping around fructose. And I think it also depends on what you tolerate, because some people just tolerate fruit better than other people too.
Yeah.
So that's an important thing to mention.
Yeah, I think it depends on the person. It depends on what you tolerate, just like you said. I think fructose, when it's packaged inside a fruit, is probably very different than high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of the research kind of seems to diverge, is between those two different contexts. In my experience, I don't think fructose is a problem as long as I think our liver's ability to process fructose, I've seen very different numbers, but there is a limited ability for us to process fructose in a day. Whereas glucose, our body can theoretically process a lot more. Fructose, some sources say only 40 grams a day, which if you look up certain fruits, there's some fruits that are really high in fructose, like blueberries, and there's some that have less, like bananas. So I think I would want to do more research on that, but I would say, it's probably not a great idea to be eating more than like, call it 3, 4, 5 servings of fruit a day, or getting all your carbs from something like honey, which I think is high in fructose. I may be wrong about that. So I think there is an upper limit to fructose, and it's probably good to move to other carbohydrate sources if you need more carbs beyond just fructose-based carbs.
Yeah, I was just actually looking it up because I was curious about the fructose in honey. And I think, what is it? 4 tablespoons, which is quite a bit of honey. It's like 300 calories almost, has something like 48 grams of fructose alone. So that's one to watch, because it's easy to overdo honey. I tried honey not too long ago and it worked pretty well, but it's just like you have a tablespoon and you're like, dang, that's really good.
Yeah.
That's really good. So that's when people need to watch out for it. It's good to kind of just take, reserve.
Yeah. So I just looked it up. It looks like honey is 50% fructose.
Okay.
And it's based on clinical trials. I have no idea how well conducted these are, but 25 to 40 grams of fructose a day is safe. So yeah, I mean, it's not that hard to get that from honey if your only carb source is honey. A cup of blueberries has 7.5 grams of fructose. So, if you have 4 cups of blueberries in a day, you're kind of knocking at that upper limit with no other sources of fructose in your diet. So I think it's definitely something to be a little bit wary of.
Yeah, and I think too, if like you're someone that is doing like the blueberry thing and you're having like 4 cups a day, that's a lot of blueberries.
Yeah.
Just think of, and if you've ever seen wild blueberries, they look different than your normal blueberries. I'm growing strawberries out in the back that are just like organic, whatever. They're like this big. They're like a pea. They're not huge. I go to the store and I'm like blown away at how big the fruit is. My favorite analogy to tell people is to watch the show Naked and Afraid.
Yeah.
And basically look at how these are survivalist experts. So look at how they're trying to do stuff, and you'll notice that they don't find a lot of things. We're given this world of abundance, and I think we take it for granted. Not that living out there is optimal either. Like, I'm sure they're developing a bunch of nutrient other problems just by being out there and doing a bunch of stuff. That's just my favorite show to reference whenever I talk about thinking about naturally and then putting it in a modern setting, is putting modern survivalists in a wild scenario and having them survive and see what they care about.
Yeah.
Which is pretty interesting.
It's a great show.
It's great. But so kind of flipping the coin here, I kind of want to get into talking about your other podcast that you just started, Making a Man, who
Yeah.
every time I think of making a man, I think of Mulan, who's a woman. If
Yeah.
anyone's never seen Mulan, so it's kind of like
Make a man
contradicting.
out of you.
So I'm going to listen to it all day now because I'm prepping for this podcast. But what was sort of your genesis of that and your interest? Because it covers quite a bit of different topics, from exercise to stoicism, all these sort of things. So
Yeah.
what was kind of your idea? I like I can see why you want to branch out. I like that. But what was kind of the genesis for that particular set of topics?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, I still really enjoy Carnivore Cast. I'm still putting it out every week. Still enjoy engaging and interviewing people, and get a lot of fulfillment out of that. But I find myself more and more so wanting to learn about these topics, like fatherhood and body image, and changing priorities over one's life, and testosterone and men's health, and all these various topics that I feel like very commonly in society, a lot of them are taboo, or a lot of them men don't feel comfortable being vulnerable about and talking openly about. And I feel like uh, some of us lack those kind of father figures in our life. And me approaching 30 now, I'm 28 years old. I wanted a forum to talk openly about some of those things, and let other men share their stories and talk openly about sexuality, homosexuality, all these things, and how it affects identity. And I wanted to engage in that community and selfishly learn from a lot of these men I look up to. So that was kind of the impetus for it. And when I was thinking about the podcast, I was thinking, man, this is going to be really tough, and it has been tough to kind of find my voice and decide how to shape the podcast. Because the Carnivore Cast, I kind of have a rhythm where if it's an expert, I have them on and I ask them questions about their topic, and I try to learn about whatever their topic is. Or if it's N equals 1 case study, I ask them about their health and their journey and what they eat now, and how it's changed. With making a man, I just have someone I look up to on, and I could ask them about, like you said, there are probably 15 different topics that I could ask them about. And I'm trying to have more experts on, like doctors who specialize in hormone replacement therapy, so I can do deep dives. But some of these men are just like dabbling in all of these areas, and I don't know where to start with their entrepreneurship journey, or body image and working out, or fatherhood, or relationships. And so I'm still trying to find my voice and trying to figure it out, but it's been fun so far.
Yeah, no, I actually am really excited that you started doing it, because one of the antithesis for our podcast, Road to Recovery, was me and my friend who I've known for several years. We met actually online doing YouTube. We have a bunch of different YouTube channels. It's like a whole business thing.
Awesome.
But not with him, different guy. It's a mess. My story's all over the place. But we met actually in the eating disorder community, because I was just starting to come out of some of my eating disorder. He was kind of still in the depths of his eating disorder. So we kind of met in a YouTube community. He was doing a lot of eating disorder videos. And my partner, who's not here, would tell you that he tried to recover being a vegan for 4 years. And that did not work out well. So but that's another topic for another day, I'm sure. But so we talk a lot about body image on here. And so it originally started as a pure eating disorder recovery podcast. And we were talking about body images, ways to recover. My friend's an eating disorder recovery coach, so he knows all this stuff. But I find it fascinating kind of talking to other people and their views on these various topics. So because of that kind of longstanding theme on our podcast, one thing I wanted to ask about you was, have you had any really interesting discussions about body image, especially in like athletics or the gym? I go to the gym and I could see people that clearly have body dysmorphia, etc., including myself.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about maybe some of your own struggles, being a little vulnerable, and then some that you've talked about, because there's a lot of commonalities.
Yeah, I am still very much, I think more so I've become satisfied with how I look. But that took a very long time. It was a long time where I saw myself in a mirror. I was just like, oh, doughy, fat, ugly person. it sounds horrible to say out loud, but that's the type of thing we say to ourselves. And, we would never say it to someone else, but it's amazing. There's this fantastic article I read the other day. I'll try to share it with you after the podcast, but it was talking about especially like men in our generation, and how we grew up with the evolution from like wanting to look like Brad Pitt in Fight Club. Like that was the iconic, like what to look like. And then the first Spider-Man movie, I don't know if you recall, but Tobey Maguire, Peter Parker, he's the very first big superhero who, he gets bitten by the spider and he takes off his shirt and he's like looking in the mirror, and all of a sudden he has, kind of some bicep muscles and some abs and a little bit of chest, and he's like kind of confused. To today, now it's like Men's Health, and like everyone is ripped and jacked, and like the Marvel superhero movies, those guys are taking crazy amounts of steroids, and people don't openly talk about steroid use and all these things that's going on. And just like what is drilled into us from Instagram and all these sources every day is completely different from what it was even 10, 20 years ago, let alone 50. And just like what it means to be a man and a part of masculinity and like looking good and looking attractive is so distorted. And people joke that like all these guys in the gym trying to look better are doing it to just get compliments from other men. It's not even women who want to see these like hyper muscular, unnatural bodies. And so I think it really is something that plagues a lot of men. And I think body image for women is talked about more openly, and there's a lot of toxic imagery and things done there with photoshopping and models and things like that. But I feel like with men, it's a bit more taboo. It needs to be talked about more openly. And I certainly am guilty of all of it. I very much will look at these fitness models and bodybuilders on Instagram and watch YouTube videos, and my perception, I can even tell, like my perception of what attractive and fit has been completely morphed and is totally distorted. So yeah, I definitely want to talk to more people about that and learn about it. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what it's been like for you.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because originally we started the podcast purely because as men with eating disorders, when you looked at the statistics, they're actually not far off from women having eating disorders. They're just talked about like 100 times less.
Yeah.
So we kind of started this to be a voice in that community because eating disorders take, and I'm not saying, by the way, that all of this like taboo stuff is just about eating disorders. This is just my personal experience.
Yeah.
But with eating disorders, they come in every size and shape. So you can have obese people that technically have disordered eating. I mean, I would say the standard American diet is kind of a disordered way to eat. For me, like I had this whole phase where, and I think like you mentioned, like you're guilty of this. Almost every guy that like tries to go to the gym is guilty of this, of just wanting to better yourself. And for me, it just manifested in an eating disorder where I got even more skinny trying to be fit. I was trying to be fit and decided, like you said, I was looking at, I think it was at the time, Hugh Jackman was doing all the Wolverine movies. And one of the things he actually has been open about is the fact that he's had to go through extreme dehydration to get his muscles to look that vascular. And that's like extremely dangerous. Yeah. So I was doing all of these crazy things, under eating, intermittent fasting, lifting really heavy for like 3 hours a day, 7 days a week. I think it was the lack of people being open about it at the time, is that I didn't have anyone to really look up to as far as what should healthy body image be like. Any areas, are there any areas that in the podcast so far, because it's a relatively new podcast, I implore people to go check it out because I find it really interesting.
Thanks.
But is there any areas that kind of have had you confused and were maybe an antithesis for starting the podcast, but still want to dive deeper in, that you're looking forward to having conversations about?
Yeah, I think a big set for me is like relationships and fatherhood. So for like me and my life, my wife and I are very close and very happy. She's my best friend, and we've been together for 8 years. We've been married for almost 2 now, and our relationship has evolved so much at different stages. We were never one to hide things from each other, but it was weird for the first like 5 years. I don't think we had a single argument, which was kind of crazy. And we we argue more now, but we communicate way more. And one person on my podcast was talking about in this interesting concept in dating, how like basically in on the first date and a lot of the early dates, most people are just acting. They're just trying to present this false self to the other person. And it's very easy for that to continue into the relationship, where you're just not showing your full self to the other person. And maybe you have an expectation of the other person that they're something that they're not. And then you start to reveal more of yourselves, and it creates friction and disappointment and resentment. And I think in my relationship with my wife, probably each year we've gone from like 10%, like showing ourselves to and 90% acting to like 20-80, and now we're probably like 95-5 or something like that. You can never be like 100% super transparent about every single thought you have in your life with another person. But I just think things like that evolution in relationships are really interesting to me, and like how to handle it, how to think about, you know, your role as a man in the relationship with a woman or a man, and how that evolves, and, you know, how to be a good dad, how to be a good father, and how that maybe changes your priorities in life. Like I'm probably going to have kids in the next 5 years, or a kid. And, you know, we have a puppy, and that's changed a lot of my life priorities, or how I view myself and my role, and my identity. And I'm curious how that will happen when I have children as well. And I want to learn from men who are like extremely successful by different measures of whatever that word means, before and after having children, and you know, how things change for them and how they manage it. So those are really like, I think a lot of that was huge impetus for me to start the show. But like I said, there are all these other topics that I am interested in, like entrepreneurship and cryptocurrency and you know, bodybuilding. And so I thought I wanted something that kind of encompasses all of it without trying to seem like I'm just completely scattered.
No, I like that a lot. I think I always say this, or I've been saying it recently, like if you want to get really knowledgeable about something or get really good at something, just start a podcast and start having people on. It's like, it's either free therapy or it's just like free advice. So, so that's kind of been my favorite thing. But I think you're right about relationships. I mean, when you're in a relationship, especially when you've never had one, and then you have your first relationship, and then it's like the first deep relationship. And this is for people that get there. When I remember my life completely changed when I had like my first long-term relationship, like the whole way I viewed, when you have something that you care about more than yourself, like you mentioned, like having kids, which is what I would imagine like fatherhood is like, when you have something that you made that you care about more than yourself and you'd like do anything for, that probably will change your entire life paradigm in ways you don't understand until it happens. So it is interesting to have conversations about those things with people that have kind of gone through this successfully, or as successful as they could be. And even then, it's still like, until you have that experience for yourself, you don't really know what the feeling is, but you probably would be a little more prepared. So I look forward to hearing the further conversations you have with people about that, because I think it's probably just a good strategy in life to try and get ahead of the ball instead of wing it. But the other thing too is about the kind of faking it in relationships is a very common theme, like you mentioned, with people. And I've noticed that within myself. And so I find it really interesting to where now I've kind of swung the pendulum to where I'm too open, and I'll like have to pull myself back because I'm at the point where I just don't care. I'm just like, I'll tell you whatever, man. I'll like go on a day and be like, yeah, by the way, my testosterone is 100. Just thought I should let you know.
Oversharing.
Oversharing. That is also a problem. But I really appreciate you coming on and talking about all this stuff. I think that you offer some valuable things to carnivore community and just, you know, people community in general. So let people know where they can find you. I know I mentioned your website earlier, but I'll put that all down in the description.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. You're a great interview. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and feel like we're very similar on a lot of things. The two podcasts are Carnivore Cast and Making a Man. You can find Carnivore Cast at carnivorecast.com, or just search Carnivore Cast on your favorite social media platform or YouTube or podcast player. And same with Making a Man. It's makingaman.co. or just search Making a Man or Making a Man Pod on any podcast player or social media platform.
Well, Scott, it was nice meeting you. I hope I didn't completely mess up your last name in the intro. I know you sent me like a little thing that said how to say it. I still have a knack for doing that, but I'll go back and listen to it.